Some people disagree on who wrote the Book of Nehemiah. However, the most common conclusion is that some segments appear to be written by Nehemiah, but overall, it was written and compiled by Ezra the scribe, and this makes most sense given that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book in the Hebrew Bible. It's also important to note that the Book of Nehemiah shares the same historical setting as the second half of the Book of Ezra. The Book of Nehemiah was written between 445 BC and 420 BC, and the earliest it could have been completed would have been 425 BC, because that's when the events of the last chapter took place. The Book of Nehemiah is a history book which continues telling the story of Israel's return from the Babylonian captivity and of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The Jews were taken captive to Babylon in 3 phases, and after 70 years in exile, they returned in 3 phases. After conquering Babylon, the Persian king Cyrus allowed the first group of Jews to return with their governor Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of King David and an ancestor of Jesus Christ. This took place around 538 BC. Ezra records this in the first few chapters of the Book of Ezra. The purpose of this return was to rebuild the temple. It was later on that the Persian king Artaxerxes I Longimanus allowed the second and third groups to return. The second group returned with Ezra himself 80 years after the first group had returned. So this was the year 458 BC, and this event is recorded in the second half of the Book of Ezra. The purpose of this return was to rebuild the law of Moses, to rebuild the structure of worship, and to rebuild the religious life of the people. The third return was 14 years after that, in 444 BC, led by Nehemiah, who then became governor in Jerusalem. Ezra records this in the Book of Nehemiah while utilizing what is most likely Nehemiah's memoirs. The purpose of this return was to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. However, Nehemiah also guides Israel's spiritual welfare by demanding they obey God's law as well. One could say they needed the wall of the law to spiritually protect them, as well as the wall of the city to physically protect them. Nehemiah was a Hebrew who was a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Nehemiah knew the temple was being rebuilt in Jerusalem, and it began to weigh heavily on his heart that there was no wall to protect the city. So he fasted and prayed about the situation, seeking God's faithfulness to his promises and his mercy. Following this, when Nehemiah was serving the king noticed that Nehemiah looked sad, and he wanted to know why. Nehemiah was afraid, thinking he would be punished. But after explaining himself, to his astonishment, the king actually allowed Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem for a time, and even provided him with authorization and supplies to rebuild the wall. In seeking to rebuild the wall, they faced external opposition. The main enemies were Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. These guys were Samaritans. Samaritans were the result of intermarriage between Israelites who were left in the land during the exile and people from the surrounding nations. These guys were displeased that someone sought the welfare of the people of Israel, and so they tried to hinder the rebuilding of the wall and what Nehemiah was seeking to achieve. It is believed that Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, and it is possible he felt his position was threatened by this rebuilding of the land of Judah. So the external opposition that Nehemiah and the Jews faced came in various forms. This involved ridicule and threats. And these enemies made a false offer to be friends with Nehemiah to get him alone so they could do him harm. They also made false threats of danger to get Nehemiah to hide in the temple and be afraid, and acting in that way, sin, so they could give him a bad name in order to taunt him. But Nehemiah didn't fall for any of these things, and he managed to counteract all of them. Nehemiah was not only a very spiritual man, but he was also very practical, and this is a good thing. When they received threats of attack, his solution was to station some people to stand guard full-time, being armed with swords, spears, and bows and arrows while the wall was being built, and for others to build full-time, but for the builders themselves to have their swords strapped to their side while they worked. So they were very well prepared for any attack, and they were able to continue the progress at the same time. The Jews also faced internal exploitation. The rich were becoming richer and the poor were becoming poorer. The people were crippled by debt. They had no choice but to mortgage their belongings, to borrow money, and to give their children to be slaves. So Nehemiah had to put a stop to all of this. Regardless of all the opposition, the wall was built within 52 days. However, the completion of the wall was only half the story of Nehemiah. The second half focuses more on repopulating the city and the complete restoration of the people both physically and spiritually. Some of this includes the lists of the returning exiles, Ezra reading and explaining the law of Moses to the people keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, the people confessing their sin to God and renewing the covenant with God, along with the list of the people who signed it. There is also the issue that few people wanted to live in the city because they were fearful of attack and it was easier to hide out in the country. So Nehemiah had to compel people to live in the city, so there is a list of people commended for living in the city. Finally, there was the dedication of the wall with a celebration. Following all of this, Nehemiah leaves Israel to return to Persia. He returns to Persia after 12 years of being in Jerusalem. So he returns to Persia in the year 432 BC and stays there for a time of 7 years. During that time, Israel falls back into error. When Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem again in the year 425 BC, he has to confront this. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah both show God repeatedly and continually restoring and reforming his people on multiple levels in spite of their unfaithfulness, complacency, and negligence. When the people had returned from the Babylonian captivity, it was not long before they returned to their sinful practices. On his return to Jerusalem, Nehemiah had to break up mixed marriages which were polluting the nation and defiling the people of God. Nehemiah confronted people who married outside Israel. He cursed them, beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. A descendant of the high priest had also become Sanballat's son-in-law, so Nehemiah chased him from his presence because he was guilty of desecrating the priesthood and the Levites. One of the priests had also prepared a place for Tobiah in the courts of the house of God, and this made Nehemiah very angry, and so he threw the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Many priests and singers had left their duties in the temple and returned to farming for their living because they were not being paid for their duties. The Sabbath was also being profaned because merchants were trying to open their shops on the Sabbath, and so Nehemiah insisted on shutting the gates every Sabbath so that this couldn't take place, and even threatened to lay hands on them if they tried to sell on the Sabbath. Nehemiah's mission was not only to rebuild the infrastructure of Jerusalem, but also to reform the people of Jerusalem. In some ways, Nehemiah typologically foreshadows various aspects of Jesus. Jesus also gave up a high position in order to identify with the situation of his people. Like Jesus, Nehemiah came with a specific mission and accomplished it. His goal was not just to bring the Jews back to Jerusalem, but to restore them. Like Jesus, he came not just for the purpose of reconciliation, but ultimately to bring full restoration and renewal. Throughout Israel's history, they kept going back into sin, and this is even after they returned from the Babylonian captivity. This pointed back to the corrupt, rebellious, fallen state of man and the need for God to save us from our own sin. God already had a plan to solve this problem. He would send the Savior to rescue them from their sin, and that is why Jesus Christ would come around 400 years later to bring redemption for all those who put their faith in him, and which will be brought to full completion when believers stand before him at the resurrection of the righteous and are free from the presence of sin altogether.